It was a cold winter night in a small countryside town, where the silence was broken only by the wind whispering through the trees. The full moon illuminated the deserted streets, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the walls of the old houses. In one of these houses lived Eduardo, a middle-aged man who appeared ordinary, but harbored a dark secret. Eduardo was married to Mariana, a kind and devoted woman who had always supported him in everything. However, a few months ago, he had begun an affair with Clara, a mysterious young woman who had arrived in town without much explanation. Clara was beautiful, but there was something in her gaze that made Eduardo uneasy, something he couldn't quite define. That night, Eduardo was at home, trying to focus on a book, but his mind kept wandering to Clara. He knew it was wrong, but he couldn't resist the fascination she held over him. Suddenly, he heard a noise coming from the kitchen. Thinking it was Mariana, he got up to investigate. Upon entering the kitchen, he found Clara sitting at the table, an enigmatic smile on her lips. Eduardo froze, unable to understand how she had entered his house. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to stay calm. Clara slowly stood up and approached him. "I missed you, Eduardo. You haven't come to see me in days," she said in a soft voice that carried an implicit threat. Eduardo felt a chill run down his spine. He knew he needed to end this, but something about Clara prevented him from acting. I can't see you anymore, Clara. It's better if we end this," he said, trying to sound firm. Clara laughed, a sound that echoed through the kitchen like a funeral bell. "You think you can just discard me, Eduardo? You don't understand, do you? I'm a part of you now, and I'm never leaving." Before Eduardo could respond, Clara disappeared, leaving him alone in the kitchen, his heart racing. He looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened, but the only thing he saw was Clara's shadow dissipating in the air. Eduardo knew something was very wrong, but he couldn't understand what. He decided he needed to uncover the truth about Clara, no matter the cost, but he had no idea what was coming. Eduardo spent the night awake, disturbed by the encounter with Clara. He tried to convince himself it was just a dream, a hallucination caused by stress. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Clara wasn't an ordinary woman, and he needed to find out what she really was. The next day, Eduardo decided to investigate Clara's past. He began by asking the older residents of the town, but no one seemed to know where she had come from. Some even claimed they had never seen her before. This only increased his unease. Determined to find answers, Eduardo went to the town's library, where he began researching old records and documents. It was there that he found something that chilled him to the bone. In an old book, he discovered the story of a woman named Clara, who had lived in the town over 100 years ago. The description matched the Clara he knew: beautiful, mysterious, and with a gaze that seemed to pierce the soul. According to the book, Clara had been accused of witchcraft and condemned to death by the local community. She was burned at the stake on a full moon night, swearing vengeance against all who had betrayed her. Eduardo felt a cold shiver as he read this. Could the Clara he knew be the same woman? Could she have returned from the dead to seek revenge? With a heavy heart, Eduardo decided to confront Clara. He went to the cabin where she lived, a small hut on the outskirts of town. When he arrived, he found the door open and entered, calling out to her. "Clara, I'm here. We need to talk." Inside the cabin, the air was heavy and the smell of sulfur was strong. Eduardo felt a presence around him, as if he were being watched. Suddenly, Clara appeared before him, a sinister smile on her lips. "You've discovered the truth, haven't you, Eduardo?" she asked, her voice echoing like a whisper. Eduardo tried to stay calm, but fear took over. "What do you want from me, Clara? Why are you doing this?" Clara laughed, a sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. "I want what's mine, Eduardo. You betrayed me, just like all the others. And now you'll pay for it." Before Eduardo could react, Clara reached out and touched his face. He felt an intense pain, as if his body were being consumed by flames. Screaming in agony, he fell to the ground as Clara watched with a look of satisfaction. "You're mine now, Eduardo. Forever," she whispered before disappearing again. Eduardo was left alone in the cabin, his body trembling and his mind confused. He knew he was in danger, but he didn't know what to do. He needed to find a way to free himself from Clara before it was too late. Eduardo woke up in his own bed, drenched, in cold sweat and with his heart racing. He looked around, expecting to see Clara in some corner of the room, but he was alone. The pain he had felt in the cabin was gone, but the memory of what had happened still haunted him. He knew he couldn't ignore the situation any longer. Clara was real, and she was determined to destroy him. Determined to free himself, Eduardo decided to seek help. He went to the town's church, where he found Father Antonio, an elderly and wise man known for his knowledge of the supernatural. Eduardo told him everything that had happened, from the beginning of the affair with Clara to the encounter in the cabin. The priest listened attentively, a serious expression on his face. "Eduardo, what you describe is very serious," said the priest after a long silence. "Clara is not an ordinary woman. She is an evil entity, a spirit seeking vengeance. You became involved with her, and now she is bound to you." Eduardo felt a lump form in his throat. "What can I do, Father? How can I get rid of her?" The priest sighed, looking at Eduardo with compassion. "It won't be easy, but there is a way. You'll need to face her, but not alone. I'll help you, but you must follow my instructions precisely." The priest explained that to rid himself of Clara, Eduardo would need to perform an exorcism ritual. He would have to return to the cabin where Clara had attacked him, and with the priest's help, expel the evil spirit once and for all. Eduardo agreed, knowing he had no other choice. That night, Eduardo and the priest went to the cabin, carrying candles, holy water, and other sacred objects. The air was heavy, and the silence was oppressive. As they entered the cabin, they felt a malevolent presence around them, as if Clara already knew they were there. "Clara, show yourself," commanded the priest in a firm, authoritative voice. Suddenly, Clara appeared before them, her eyes filled with hatred and disdain. "You've brought help, Eduardo. Did you think that would be enough to get rid of me?" she said, her voice echoing like thunder. The priest began reciting prayers in Latin, sprinkling holy water toward Clara. She screamed in pain as if the water were burning her. Eduardo stood frozen, watching the scene with a mix of fear and hope. "You do not belong in this world, Clara. Return to where you came from," shouted the priest, his voice echoing throughout the cabin. Clara fought against the priest's words, but she seemed to be losing strength. Her body began to disintegrate as if consumed by an invisible flame. "You won't get rid of me so easily, Eduardo!" she screamed before disappearing completely. The cabin fell silent, and the heavy air began to dissipate. Eduardo looked at the priest, tears in his eyes. "Is she gone?" he asked, his voice trembling. The priest placed a hand on Eduardo's shoulder. "Yes, Eduardo. Clara has been expelled, but you must learn from this. Evil always demands a price, and you almost paid with your life." Eduardo knew the priest was right. He had made a terrible mistake by getting involved with Clara, and he had almost lost everything because of it. He promised himself he would never again allow himself to be seduced by evil. Despite Clara's expulsion, Eduardo couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The nights were the worst. He would wake up sweating, the sound of laughter echoing in his ears, as if Clara were still there, watching him from the shadows. Mariana, his wife, noticed the change in him. He was distant, frightened, and she didn't understand why. "Eduardo, what's happening to you?" she asked one night as he stared out the window, as if expecting to see something outside. "You haven't been yourself lately." Eduardo hesitated. He wanted to tell the truth, but how could he explain something so absurd? How could he tell the woman he loved that he had betrayed her with an evil entity? He knew he couldn't keep it a secret forever, but the fear of losing her was greater than anything else. "It's nothing, Mariana," he replied, avoiding her gaze. "I'm just tired, that's all." Mariana didn't seem convinced, but she decided not to press him. She knew something was wrong, but she had no idea how deep the abyss Eduardo had fallen into was. Days passed, and the tension in the house only grew. Eduardo began to notice strange things, objects moving on their own, doors slamming for no reason, and sometimes he swore he saw Clara reflected in the mirrors, always with that sinister smile. He tried to ignore it, but he knew Clara hadn't truly left. She was still there, waiting. One night, while Mariana slept, Eduardo decided to face his fears. He took a candle and went down to the basement where he kept old belongings. There, he found a dusty box that had belonged to his grandmother. Inside, it was an old prayer book and a silver crucifix. He didn't know why, but he felt those objects could help him. As he held the crucifix, he felt a wave of calm, as if something were protecting him. It was then that he heard a noise behind him. He turned quickly and saw Clara, standing in the corner of the basement, her eyes filled with hatred. "You really think this will stop me, Eduardo?" she whispered, her voice seeming to come from all directions. "I'm a part of you now. You'll never get rid of me." Eduardo gripped the crucifix tightly, trying to stay calm. "You don't scare me anymore, Clara. I know what you are, and I won't let you destroy me." Clara laughed, a sound that echoed through the basement like thunder. "You're weak, Eduardo. You always were, and now you'll pay for everything you've done." She lunged at him, but Eduardo raised the crucifix, reciting a prayer he had read in the book. Clara screamed, as if she were being burned, and retreated. "This isn't over, Eduardo," she screamed before disappearing again. Eduardo was left, alone in the basement, trembling but with a sense of relief. He knew Clara was still there, but now he had a weapon against her. He could no longer run. It was time to face the evil head-on. Eduardo knew he couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. Clara was growing stronger, more present, and he couldn't continue living in fear of her appearing at any moment. He decided it was time to end it once and for all. With the crucifix and the prayer book in hand, he went to the cabin where it had all begun, determined to face Clara. The night was dark, and the wind howled through the trees, as if nature itself were warning him of the danger ahead. When he arrived at the cabin, Eduardo felt an intense cold, as if the air were charged with negative energy. He took a deep breath, trying to prepare himself for what was to come. As he entered the cabin, he found Clara waiting for him, a sinister smile on her lips. "I knew you'd come, Eduardo," she said, her voice echoing in his mind. "You've finally decided to face your fate." Eduardo gripped the crucifix tightly, feeling the protective energy it emanated. "This ends here, Clara. I won't let you destroy me." Clara laughed, a sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You're funny, Eduardo. Do you really think you can defeat me? I'm stronger than you could ever imagine." Eduardo began reciting the prayers from the book, his voice firm and determined. Clara screamed in pain as if the words were burning her. She tried to approach him, but the crucifix kept her at bay. "You do not belong in this world, Clara. Return to where you came from," Eduardo shouted, his voice echoing throughout the cabin. Clara fought against Eduardo's words, but she seemed to be losing strength. Her body began to disintegrate, as if consumed by an invisible flame. "You won't get rid of me so easily, Eduardo," she screamed before disappearing completely. The cabin fell silent, and the heavy air began to dissipate. Eduardo fell to his knees, exhausted but relieved. He knew Clara had been expelled, but he also knew the scars she had left on his life would never fully disappear. When he returned home, Eduardo found Mariana waiting for him, her eyes filled with worry. "Where were you, Eduardo? I was so worried." Eduardo looked at her, tears in his eyes. "I had to face something, Mariana. Something I brought into our lives. But it's over now, I promise." Mariana hugged him, asking no questions. She knew Eduardo had been through something terrible, and she was willing to stand by him, no matter what. Eduardo knew the battle with Clara had changed him forever. He had learned that evil could hide in the most seductive forms, and that the choices we make could have terrible consequences. But he also knew that, with love and faith, it was possible to face even the greatest fears. And so, Eduardo and Mariana began to rebuild their lives, knowing that while the past could never be erased, the future was still in their hands.